Yeah, everybody, welcome to this ACJR chat, about Bitcoin L2s, whatever your reporter needs to know. That's the working title. So I'll be your host today, Pete Rizzo, editor of Bitcoin Magazine, editor at large at Kraken Cryptocurrency Exchange. And then if you follow me on X, Bitcoin historian there. We're going to begin with our panelists. We've got Kyle Ellicott. Did I get that right?
Yep. Hi, everybody.
Are you of the Stacks Foundation? Is that the correct title?
I am a part of the entire Stacks organization. I formerly was managing director and partner for Bitcoin Frontier Fund, dating back to 2021. So running our ecosystem fund for Stacks, then later expanding out to the greater Bitcoin ecosystem. And now just joined in as the interim executive director for the Stacks Asia Foundation, which was just announced earlier today too.
So an ecosystem participant here, trying to move Bitcoin forward towards a certain future. And then we've got Will Foxley, veteran of CoinDesk and other crypto media, and co-founder of Blockspace Media, which is, I guess I'll let you introduce it.
Yeah, we're an industry publication, kind of niching down into mining, Bitcoin season 2, as we like to call it, and then a little bit of like the venture / startup space that spans both crypto and Bitcoin, but Bitcoin first, mostly talking about like all things block space and the economics of block space.
All right, so I guess I'll open it up with a bit of an overture, right? So I think since the launch of Ordinals in 2023, which was a kind of new protocol or meta protocol for Bitcoin that kind of was focused on the NFT market, there's been a, I guess, revive movement to build on Bitcoin and to scale Bitcoin. And I think maybe worth kind of thinking those as two separate things. But yeah, I mean, there are other layers on Bitcoin today, right? So perhaps the most kind of well-known is Lightning, right? It's been operational for about 5 years. The technical development on that goes back almost a decade, about 5,000 Bitcoin worth of liquidity on that network. But obviously there's some either dissatisfaction with that approach or kind of optimism around potentially scaling Bitcoin in other ways. And the last thing that I would add is I think the conversation on Bitcoin scaling, quote unquote, or what that means kind of really goes all the way back to 2009, the kind of the first emails between Satoshi and this other cryptographer named James A. Donald, who, his first response on the thread when Satoshi launched this was essentially, wouldn't scale. It's essentially blockchains have this limitation. We have to kind of, record all the data for every transaction and share it amongst users. And that this is, essentially would cripple the idea, would never get off the ground. Of course, James A. Donald's maybe a bit wrong these days. I know he's out there somewhere. But yeah, that's the legacy of this conversation remains. So I guess maybe I'll kick it over to Will and Kyle. Obviously, we can maybe just back up and say like, okay, what does it mean for Bitcoin to scale? And then what does it mean to scale in layers? How did we develop this approach, or why did this become kind of the ecosystem standard? Will, Kyle, maybe you want to take that up.
Kyle, you got first.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So when I started getting involved in this ecosystem in 2021, ecosystem being Bitcoin overall, to Pete's point, there were just really the core 4 layers that were highly talked about and active in some cases. And the most active at the time were Stacks and Lightning. We also had Rootstock that was semi there trying to rebalance and kind of figure out its direction. And then Liquid, which was in a different position and mostly focusing, if I'm correct, on core development around the Bitcoin core itself. And so these were these 4 different networks that together provided different functionality and different purpose to what was possible on Bitcoin and what could scale the idea of either BTC or Bitcoin's L1 going to a much more mass audience than just the limited amount of holders that were sitting on it as well. And the one that did take off the most in its earliest time was Lightning. And that was due to the fact that it was focused on payments and on the early DeFi space when it came to Bitcoin. There were some things that worked and there were some things that didn't work. And as that payment channel started to evolve, we started to see some issues with how Lightning was then growing and scaling and how it might need to do further in the future. Stacks entered the world in 2021 and brought in the early additions of smart contracts and programmability, allowing for a DApp ecosystem, a decentralized application ecosystem, to be built leveraging Bitcoin as a settlement layer, as Stacks and Bitcoin were paired one-to-one. So their transactions worked in parallel. And
Well,
Stacks
maybe
could
we
read.
can, oh, sorry. Didn't mean to cut
Oh,
you
I
off.
was just saying, and I know it's okay. I was just gonna say it could read the Bitcoin state as well. So setting that as the stage, just to quickly come to close. So that was what we had in that early 20s time. That kind of built us up. It was about 12 years with a bunch of other stuff that happened, built up that first era of Bitcoin that said, hey, here's maybe what's possible beside what we saw with SegWit, Taproot, and the original white paper. And then that led us into this next kind of era we're in right now. And Pete, I'll stop in just a moment. So apologies for the rant.
No worries.
But with those four things and a few others, four networks and a few others, is that for Bitcoin to have any utility, BTC to have any utility, it had to have additional layers. It had to have a technical stack built on top of that core L1 to enact some kind of application layer and much more in between, which is a quick summary of what happened.
Yeah, a lot to cover, a lot of intricacies. We'll want to cut you in the conversation here. Definition of scaling, your view of the topology, where are we at? Why are we talking about it?
Yeah, I'll let you do like kind of the early stuff because I think you're probably the guy for it. I think from like a technical perspective, what I've mostly seen is like there's a difference between scaling a system and throughput for a system. Scaling a system would allow you to have more users on the system, but not necessarily add much more constraints on the hardware level. So we don't want to constrain a Bitcoin node. We don't want to be adding like so much data to it that we're not going to be able to have those precious Raspberry Pis spinning all over the world. And if we just increase throughput, well, that can be great, but you might be adding more hardware constraints. And so you might have heard like the roll-up model. A lot of people, if you go back to like the earlier stuff on like ETH research in 2019, 2020, they say that's a throughput design. And that's why we're having a lot of problems with them right now on the ETH network and
Right.
actually with the Bitcoin world as well. I think the idea for Bitcoin mostly goes back to the idea of a UTXO. So what are we going to do with like this base piece of data that I can own as like a sovereign individual, right? Like I can use my hardware wallet and a seed phrase I control and have a UTXO, a piece of a Bitcoin. Excuse the nomenclature, but it's kind of easy how to say it like that, or it's easier to say it like that. I can use this UTXO and I can do whatever I want with it. I can send it to someone else. I can put it into a covenant and have some sort of procedure about how I want it to be sent somewhere or not sent somewhere. And then there's even this world where maybe there's like applications that run on top of this UTXO. I can have it be put into a Lightning channel. I can have it run into some sort of EVM network. And people have had a lot of ideas around how to use those UTXOs, but unfortunately, UTXOs have some issues, right? It's hard to send that data around. It's hard to use that data for a lot of different people. In the Lightning world, you can get super complex with this. Like, can a lot of people own the same UTXO? Can people share that? And so I think for Bitcoin, the biggest problem, going back to Pete's beginning there, is the blockchain system that Satoshi ended up using with this UTXO system has a lot of constraints built into it versus some other models. But those constraints are also good things, right? So it's just trade-offs. And so I think for right now, L2 builders, they're looking at the system and saying, hey, can we use some of these things that the ETH community has cobbled together the last few years? Yes or no? I think a lot of VCs are thinking yes. I think a lot of people in the dev world are saying and screaming no. And now journalists are trying to figure out which way should we go. And I think for like the broader Bitcoin core community, Bitcoin developer community, they're still in the same place. It's basically Lightning, maybe a few other ideas like Arc, Alpin, stuff like that. Maybe some new opcodes, but we actually haven't moved that far from what I'd say is we've been talking about for the last 5 to 7 years.
Well, of course, we've got journalists here, sticklers for words, definitions, want to drop something in the chat. So, Bitcoin Magazine, perhaps one of the few media outlets that has kind of come up with a taxonomy, however unpopular or debated, kind of around what is a Bitcoin layer, what is a layer 2. Obviously, this is an evolving conversation. We've got a lot of people here who might be writing stories, kind of dealing with different ecosystem participants. And the challenge with that is they're always trying to represent their technology in a favorable way, and that favorable way kind of conflicts maybe with what the community aspires to. So I guess just dropping that in there for people to look at. But it does seem like there's a desire to have a really high bar in terms of a definition of layer 2. I think, as Will was saying, right, there is this aspiration amongst the kind of older, more experienced kind of Bitcoin builders to sort of say, unless you can unilaterally control your Bitcoin on the chain, unless you can, without trusting any group of people or plurality of people, withdraw your Bitcoin into your own custody in any adversarial situation, that's not good enough. That's the definition that we want to put out there for an L2, and whether builders like it or not, that's kind of what we're going to draw as the line in the sand. Obviously, there are technologists who think that there's value in kind of these other arrangements. So maybe Kyle, I'll throw it over to you. What's your definition of an L2? Do you think this kind of trustless kind of nature is a good one? And I guess the last part of that is, what would you say to the protocols that are trying to kind of weaken this definition or change this definition? How should they present what the work that they're doing?
Yeah, so maybe think I'll start maybe in the middle there. So in terms of trustless, I mean, to my knowledge, when it comes to the Bitcoin ecosystem right now, we don't have full, true trustless transactions or interactions. So we have trust minimized, but not fully trustless yet. That's what, to your last question, is being challenged, I think, in a good way. And to Will's point, a lot of things were kind of copy and pasted from the Ethereum ecosystem or EVM as well. So the Ethereum virtual machine ecosystems as well. And initially that was okay because it gave us a foundation. Ethereum's entire ecosystem had almost 7 years worth of additional expansive development, technically, and from a greater adoption standpoint than Bitcoin had to date. And so it was an interesting place to say, okay, work there, it should work here. Now, to that point, I also agree to another comment of Will's is that isn't necessarily what should happen as well. And so just because it worked in Ethereum doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work in Bitcoin. And we're seeing that very particular around definitions and also around its greater technicals as well. So the definition of an L2 from what we'd seen in Ethereum was really summarized in the word of scale. It provided scalability. There were more technical definitions around it, but from my standpoint, my research, my investments, my activity in the industry, it was always known as scaling. That layer was to help scale whatever application you were building and take it into a faster, better approach as well. On the Bitcoin side, I think that I know there was an early effort to copy and paste and say that this is just scaling. This is just exactly what we've always had. To Will's point, you now have a lot more efforts around things like UTXOs. There was mention of ARC. You also have Arch Network that is working on various efforts. You have BitLayer, you have Botanics, and you also have Bob, you have Merlin, you have all these different networks that have started to introduce new ways of consensus, new ways of thinking and redefining those terms that we knew yesterday to what they can mean tomorrow. And it's also challenged the entire technical stack. The technical stack which is a very crazy roadmap if you actually find one, that it takes to build an Ethereum application is not one-to-one that it takes to build an application on Bitcoin.
Your definition of L2, it sounds like, is something that provides scaling. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
What relationship does that have to have with Bitcoin? Can I just make a Pete Bitcoin and that's a scaling layer?
I would love to see Pete Bitcoin as a scaling layer. That said, no, I think from a scaling solution standpoint, in L2 and Bitcoin Magazine put out to your point, a very noted and highly controversial or discussed definition, which I think is fair. No one else had put one out at the time. And so it was a good base of a conversation. BitcoinLayers.org has continued to push that forward further. Yeah, they're doing great work. And so from Bitcoin standpoint right now, I still look at it as that scaling solution. But again, scale when it comes to Bitcoin is not just one type of network or one type of process. It's much more than that. From what I've seen.
I think the conversation here is, what's your definition of an L2? It sounds like Kyle's talking about, the Springs added functionality to Bitcoin, but of course we want there to be some relationship to Bitcoin, right? And Lightning, it's I'm locking my Bitcoin in a contract. My Bitcoin moves into another area where it gets new capabilities. What's your definition? How do you look at it?
Yeah, so I gave half of it earlier. Basically, the idea that we don't want to add more hardware constraints as much as possible to the base layer in order to bring more people on the chain. So, difference between scaling and throughput. A lot of things we're seeing right now are throughput designs. They're going to end up loading the chain, adding more data. The other idea, which is linked in this Peter Todd piece I put into the chat, is the idea that I can exit out of a system with my UTXO or whatever token that we're talking about in other systems without needing permission from the L2 design. So we're not talking about necessarily scaling the L1. We're not talking about just getting more people onto Bitcoin itself in this scaling conversation for the most part. Most people are talking about a secondary layer on top of Bitcoin because we kind of have met the place where Bitcoin can have so many users. So we have to go up one layer. And for this, we need to talk about not adding more constraints to the L1, not adding more data to the chain, and then being able to unilaterally exit from the L2. So if I'm in a rollup or I'm in a Botanix spider web or whatever they call it, or I'm
Spider chain.
spider chain,
Yeah.
if I'm in one of these things, I can say, hey, you know what? I don't like what you guys are doing. I don't trust you. And I'm going to hit this button and I'm going to leave your network minus the cost of the gas or the sats per V byte at the time and move that Bitcoin back into my wallet on the L1 without needing permission from a sequencer, a validator set, or anyone else. Lightning has this property. There's only like very few small instances where there'd be a problem with this, but for the most part, Lightning really fits this definition. L2s sometimes can, the fully fleshed out, well, I shouldn't say L2s, rollups. The really fleshed out rollups can do this in theory, but a lot of them are not really past that point decentralization, especially the more mature Ethereum ones that have been running for a few years and have huge treasuries. So there's still not a lot of great ideas around this. There's still a lot of work to be done. But yeah, that'd be my definition. And I refer people to this Peter K. Todd piece and then also Bitcoin layers.
Mm. Well, of course, we got a bunch of journalists here. I remember from my time in the industry, writing daily in terms of having an active beat. You never want to kind of write about a project in a way that it is inaccurate, or in the worst case scenario, kind of get scammed by people who are looking to make a quick buck, launch a product with some exciting language around it. So I guess the question, maybe flipping this on its head a little bit to Kyle and Will, whoever wants to answer first. What are some of the questions that you ask when reviewing an L2? So somebody comes out with a new proposal, when you're evaluating it, what do you ask? And, what are the red flags, right? So if there's something is there anything that if you were to see when you were evaluating this project, where you would be obscenely skeptical? I mean, I remember yesterday I was looking at fractal Bitcoin, right? This is a exciting project, and the claim is that because it's merged mined with Bitcoin, it's a side chain. So my own kind of red flags went off. Didn't really see a relationship with Bitcoin. How are you evaluating it? Which questions you're asking? What kind of questions should these guys write down when they're looking at these proposals?
Does it have a token? It's always the first question because just kind of shows you where the incentives are. And I do think there's a world where tokens can make sense for some layer twos, but I think it's very, very few and far between. I just keep the door open more or less. I don't think I have actually seen one that I like, but I'll keep the door open if there is one
Just
that.
straight off the bat. So okay, so say you get a proposal. It says it has a token, but obviously there are, Liquid Network, has its own token. Ordinals, a protocol for tokens. Rune's protocol for tokens. They don't have their own native token. So you're saying a native token for you is the red flag?
Yeah, native tokens. So like the Optimism network, for example, or OP, if you've seen that on Ethereum, like they've just kind of thrown a lot of their token out there. They've used it for many, many purposes, many parties, many grants, developer stuff. And, maybe you like that. Maybe you think that kind of helps bring people to your chain and kind of bootstraps like the flywheel to get everyone there. But I think if you want to scale Bitcoin, then you should be using Bitcoin on the L2, just like Lightning does. I think that is the goal. And I think adding another token into that is immediately just a place where we have insiders going to
I do
pull
think that was a
value from
big
the
reason
chain.
that Ordinals was able to get such a large buy-in within the community, even though it was
100%.
stomped on a lot of community norms. I think it sort of upheld the central post of that. Kyle,
Yeah.
moving over to you, when you're evaluating this stuff, people are coming out and they're saying, "Hey, we compete with Stacks. We're better than Stacks." I mean, how are you how are you evaluating them? What are the red flags?
Yeah, I mean, stacks aside, I mean, any ecosystem, excuse me, any protocol, any network, any layer, however you want to define it. In addition to Will's point, maybe two others. First and foremost, on the journalist side, you have an advantage that most of the founders or most of the projects that are pitching you may not realize that you have, is that you're seeing all these different terms and definitions and keywords that they're using, and whether they're also launched or they're not as well. And so you're able to very quickly pick up and just using it as one that's commonly used, BitVM. Right now is still in early development. It's still, I don't want to say conceptual because things are progressing, but it's not here today. So if you see a project, Pete Bitcoin, for instance, is coming to you and saying, we have a full BitVM support as of today, you should each and every one of you think that is another red flag. That is not
Eventually someone will do that, right? So let's just take that
something
example.
someone will. Just using
Somebody
that as
will.
an example.
So how do you know how do you know though when that person comes to you with that genuine invention?
Yeah, so I think again, having that either as an investor or as a journalist or anyone that's an analyst in this industry, you have that knowledge of what's out there and what's not, and are able to challenge it or know very quickly off the bat that this isn't happening right now. And outside of Will's point around tokens, I'm actually looking more so at your ecosystem. So if you're building a layer, you're building a network, you're building a protocol, I want to know what you actually have as an ecosystem to call yourself an ecosystem. Do you have native applications or do you have partnered applications? Are the applications that you say are a part of your ecosystem actually built natively in other areas, whether that be in Ethereum, whether that be on another chain, or were they built from the ground up utilizing your technical stack as well? Do you have developers? Where are these developers coming from as well? And then from there, my investor hat gets on. I start to get into very nitty gritty details around things like TVL to then wallet activity, unique, active, and otherwise as well. But I think the three there: token, terminology, and then what's actually happening on the ecosystem side.
Yeah, maybe interjecting my own experience from Ordinals, right? I think I remember when that came out in February 2013. There was a lot of speculation about it. I think what I did to validate it was I really just went into the Discord forums, right? And I think I spent about a week, and by the end of the week, I was in 200 different Ordinals projects that were either minting, talking about minting, or able to actively mint those projects, right? So that was a big thing for me where it was very clear that whatever was happening here, there was market demand. It wasn't theoretical, and that it had sort of passed this Rubicon into, okay, here were real users and people struggling to kind of use Bitcoin wallets, use the Lightning wallets, kind of do things for the first time. But want to stick with something you said, Kyle, there. You talked about TVL. Obviously, there's this idea that there are metrics or milestones, right? Some of them that are kind of active in use in Ethereum and other cryptocurrencies. So I guess a question that I would move to now, again, journalists here want to write and cover the news. What metrics or milestones do you think are newsworthy at this point? Is every funding round newsworthy? How do you know what is newsworthy at this point? What are you looking at, Kyle, Will?
Yeah, maybe Will and I will agree or disagree on this one, but I think it depends on your beat from a funding perspective. Funding news is funding news. Sometimes it's on point, sometimes it's delayed. That's I would look to and defer to each of you on
Bitcoin raises $500,000, to put feet on the blockchain.
Again, Peep blockchain is going to be very successful.
Big, right?
Yeah, it's going to be huge. I think funding is still an interesting milestone, especially if it comes to a project, to a technology, to an innovation that hasn't been covered much, and you're starting to see capital move into it. Whether it's a single or it's a big bucket of what happened in a quarter, what happened in a moment of time, I think that can still be interesting. I've brought that in from my analyst background to my investor background. I think it's interesting. It also helps to show pulse as to where things are moving as an industry as well. Outside of that, again, I still think native applications. If you have the first DEX decentralized exchange launched on a network. That is a big moment for an ecosystem or for a protocol. And so seeing those first applications, I think, are still very much newsworthy. On a TVL side and maybe a user side, I think when we start to see user bases start to hit over a particular threshold, and just kind of speaking out loud here, seeing numbers in the hundreds of thousands hitting into the millions and beyond that as well, I think starts to really begin to move the needle as to what's happening on a project as well. So seeing those larger and larger numbers, with note that the Bitcoin ecosystem and Web3 as a whole isn't hasn't been around long term to see tens and hundreds of millions as we saw in SaaS and mobile. So it's something that seems small, but is going to start growing exponentially as well.
What are you using? Like what resources are you using right now to track these different metrics and to compare these different protocols? Is there a data website that you're recommending that you're on every day that you're refreshing?
Yep. Signal 21 is definitely one I'm using, along with Dune Analytics, and then Glassnode are probably the three most common that I'm using right now.
Well, over to you. We're talking about newsworthy milestones. We're talking before about the definitions, now moving to, okay, when do you cover this stuff? Okay, maybe fundraising, you raise some money, you get an article, but everybody here wants to be first, right? So how do you know you've got a newsworthy Bitcoin L2 story?
Yeah, I actually would probably disagree with Kyle on a few of these things. I think TVL is bullshit, so don't use it. If someone comes with a TVL story, really dig into that.
Will, I want to agree with you on that.
Okay,
I want to
good.
agree with you. I didn't finish my point, but there's a difference in the world that has changed in the Bitcoin ecosystem. We can cover that afterwards, but I agree with you on that point.
Yeah, the TVL stuff, like people just say like, oh, we have his wallet is loosely connected to us, has a lot of Bitcoin. It's therefore volume on our network. So don't pay attention to that. It's bullshit. Also, I'd say be very careful funding rounds. You don't know when people got funding. You don't know who they got funding from. You don't know what's contingent on. Funding rounds are great in terms of like generic large numbers, I'd say, like quarter over quarter, a year over year. I think that stuff is kind of nice. And I like how the Block and some other companies have covered that. But like for standalone projects, raising a few $1 million, I just don't think matters that much these days, especially with how many, I'd say like ETH whales, Sol whales, and things like that are kind of popping up. And they are so happy to throw off a few of their bags just to make larger bags. So be careful about that. I think the biggest thing I'd go back to is just like what were the early signs for chains that got really big in 2021? So I think of Binance Smart Chain. If I was a journalist or a researcher and really wanted to dig into what's going to pop, I'd go back and look at what were some of the metrics that kind of led up to that moment. And I don't know them off the top of my head. Like I would assume it has something to do with chain bloat, soon as something to do with transaction fees increasing, even though it's only going to be like moving over a few decimal spots, but that does show network activity. And then I would say, like, where are some of the larger players in the ecosystem that have a ton of capital going to start pushing for like these Bitcoin L2s? Because I do think some of these Bitcoin L2s get really big in terms of like user adoption, quote unquote. But I think it's going to be the same game casino as last time, and they'll be gone within a year or two. If this whole world habits, if we have like a rerun of 2021.
Well, let's take a more specific example, maybe, right? We have seen a competition now of token standards on Bitcoin, right? There's multiple, there's BRC, there's runes, there's also maybe catnip if that becomes a real thing, out yesterday. So let's just take this as a field, right? Like say you're a journalist kind of on this call, you're tasked with kind of looking at tokens on Bitcoin. What's newsworthy in an environment where you have kind of multiple, layers competing for a use case? How do you cover that, or how would you think about covering that?
So at Blockspace, we're taking a different approach because we're very industry focused. So we are in the DMs and chats with people and seeing where sort of like the people who actually know what they're talking about are discussing, and that's who we're focused on. So people who have worked on Bitcoin Core, people who work at Bitcoin Core adjacent things, and then also like a lot of the deep ordinals and runes degens, because that's what interests us. And so a lot of our coverage focuses on that. If you're at a more generalistic publication, a CoinDesk, a Bitcoin Magazine, something like that, Yeah, it's kind of hard to know, Pete. Like honestly, I don't really envy that spot because
Right.
what do you want to pick? Last cycle was the same thing. You had to kind of guess, and then all of a sudden, like one chain blew up and one chain
Well, I
didn't
think what
blow
I'm
up.
talking about here is, as you say, right, there is a risk that when you write about a project, someone might put their
Yeah,
Bitcoin on that network. They might move their Bitcoin over to that network. They might make a purchase. And then, I
it's
think the
gone.
worst case scenario is that you as a journalist don't want to recommend that someone puts themselves or their capital at risk. So I guess still the question here, I guess, is, how do you make sure you're speaking to that end user? And what advice to journalists would you give them about thinking about, the actual readers of their story and what they need to kind of use these networks? Will, Kyle?
Yeah, we do a lot of disclosures very heavily in the stuff we read about. So we wrote about fractal Bitcoin this morning, and it's laced with disclosures. I mean, you can't even get a node running for this
Yeah,
network very easily.
let's hear
Yeah.
some. What do you got?
Some disclosures, I can pull it up, but for the most part, it's be careful with your Bitcoin. Don't send your Bitcoin where you don't want it to be.
Mhm.
Make sure you know like the end address for it. What we put here: Blockspace urges caution when following third-party guides and does not endorse any specific token nor the fractal Bitcoin software itself. Do your own research, people. We're not responsible if you brick your computer.
Hmm.
So I mean,
And
there's different
do
ways of approaching this, but like, yeah, if I was a journalist, I wouldn't want to be responsible for someone, sending their Bitcoin to the wrong place just because they thought they're going to make a quick buck. At the same time, this is a very self-sovereign ecosystem, especially in Bitcoin
Mhm.
versus crypto, and you're responsible for your own decisions. So I can kind of see both sides here.
and
The
I'll
question is,
take maybe.
how do you write for this end user? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay. I was actually just gonna comment on a word that you noted, and then to the question is, first and foremost, the tokens that we have seen when it comes to the Bitcoin ecosystem, we can't yet call them standards. In my personal opinion, they have been around in the public form for generously 9 months, and one of them only for about 3.5 months. So, from a journalist perspective, I also covered this as an analyst in my last just general research report, diving across this entire industry. That these are token experiments; they're not yet token standards. And using that type of verbiage around this is new, and some of the disclosures that Will mentioned, this is new, this is experimental, this has only been around for a short period. I think also helps to provide that insight of, hey, I'm giving you as much information as I have. I've talked to some of the core developers, I've talked to some of the projects, I've given you all of this information. It's also still new. And with disclosures like Will and his team have, I think that starts to help provide more information as well. So switching the terminology from standard to experiment, and at some point they may
Hmm.
become a standard. And I will use a very specific example around this when it comes to the Bitcoin ecosystem is that BRC20, when it first launched, quickly had two derivatives that came right off of it, ORC and SRC20,
Hmm.
that were all supposed to be evolutions of the original BRC20. And then the second example came as runes began to launch, that all of a sudden BRC, having been out in public for about 4 or 5 months, was no longer a successful project, that it was done, and that runes was going to take over and be the future. All of that can't be decided in most cases looking at the dating back to history around technology and the areas that we have all covered, built, or invested in. Those types of decisions don't happen in weeks. They don't happen in days. They happen over much longer periods as well. And so I caution the use of the word standard versus again helping to provide that term of experiment as well.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so
So
that's definitely
obviously,
one. And then last,
hmm,
source. I was sorry, Pete. I was just gonna say source everything.
hmm,
When I go through and I research this entire topic that we're talking about right now, I looked up every single token. I went into Discords, I went into chats, I talked to people, I looked at anything and everything that said it was a token related to Bitcoin, and then started to dive in. Was it real? Was it a white paper, et cetera? And was able to say, here are the 12 that exist today that are new and experimental. Here are a handful that are just white papers only. And here are the sources, here's the data, here's this, here's that. To back to Will's point, then with disclosures to say, here's literally everything. It's an experiment. Do your own
hmm.
research as well.
Do your own research. All right. Well, we obviously want to get some time for some people to ask some questions. I've got one more of my own here. Maybe relates to some of the people here who have, been doing coverage, right? Obviously, layers have been active on other networks for a while. We've seen, Ethereum come out, has, maybe what some would argue some mature L2s. So I guess as ecosystem participants, what has been your view on the coverage of crypto L2s? What do you think was done well while these experiments were becoming standards, or in that process, what can we learn? What don't we want to repeat? What was successful? Will, Kyle?
I'm also interested in your answer since you were kind of helming some stuff at Bitcoin Mag, because that was the one that kind of came to mind is like when ordinals first came out, you guys clarified your editorial position, said like this kind of fits within our editorial purview. We're not going to talk about L2 tokens. We're not going to talk about anything that has a token. You guys caught a lot of flack on both sides. And I think there was like one sort of like sponsored piece, or it was like just an
Yeah.
ad that got through, and everyone was like, yeah, Bitcoin Magazine.
Right.
So it's just like it's hard to cover this stuff without people getting pissy on either side. But from my standpoint, I try to just we're a little bit broader at Blockspace on purpose because our mandate is to cover the Blockspace ecosystem from a purview of helping to scale Bitcoin. And I think we can talk about fractal Bitcoin. We can talk about some of these L2s, but we do it with the position of skepticism because there's just been abundant reasons to be skeptical. But Pete, like, what do you think about it since you've been sort of maintaining decisions at Bitcoin Mag?
Well, I mean, I didn't really watch the kind of crypto L2 coverage, super closely, right? I think in terms of how Optimism, I've bridged a few tokens like here and there just to kind of check out the user experience, right? But I think I've been pretty divorced from that, and I've really only checked back in now that it seems like the discussion in Ethereum is that the economic relationship between these, new layers and Ethereum might not be desired, right? So it seems like, I kind of check back in around those theoretical type discussions. I mean, as it relates to Bitcoin, I think, and journalism, like you're always going to be challenged by market adoption, right? I think that's the thing that ordinals really kind of hit, right? Is that there was a organizational necessity for us to say something about it. Merely because user growth, was very obvious. You had metrics come out really quickly about the number of the inscriptions that were being done, and I think very quickly you were seeing a pattern where people were putting 10,000, 100,000 blocks of data that they were claiming have value on the blockchain within a day, right? It was a very different scenario. And the same thing with the mempool, which I think is something that I would actually encourage a lot of journalists to check out. I think if you're not a Bitcoin native journalist, mempool.space is a great resource, right? So as someone who's running the Bitcoin network and is a member of that network, it's kind of incumbent on you to kind of be aware of, kind of the total system resources. And mempool.space is nice because it shows you what the average fee rates are, right? If you're sending a Bitcoin transaction, you want to be aware of that, even if you're just sending your own Bitcoin to cold storage, right? That's something people are monitoring. And then it'll show you kind of, how much data is in each block, right? So essentially, how much demand is there for block space from these other protocols, right? So I think the real controversy around, Bitcoin as a commons, right, and a mempool.space really, once there was a desire for readers with questions, right, people needed to have questions answered. We were able to react to that. And then, the question was, of course, at Bitcoin Magazine, I think we're probably one of the major crypto medias, the only thesis-based publications, right? We have an explicit thesis in that, we believe that Bitcoin is the only blockchain network that's going to scale and become widely used. We have a pretty dismissive to negative view on most cryptocurrencies, but right, obviously ordinals challenged that immediately because it allowed for speculative assets, in a way that we really hadn't seen for 5 or 6 years, right? It just had moved to other chains. And, obviously now we're seeing that move back. But I think that is because, there is, this renewed limit idea that the kind of unlimited scaling that these other blockchains promised, is sort of itself constrained, right? That's why I kind of led with the Satoshi example at the beginning. I think, as I've kind of progressed in cryptocurrency journalism, it's like you kind of have to keep in mind that this is science, right? I often say like make Bitcoin science again. This is science, and in the science of Bitcoin and blockchains, we don't know how to accommodate millions to billions of users within a blockchain because of how the dynamics of how it works, right? You just have to kind of share data with the network periodically. at some intervals for it to be secure. And that data can't be infinite, right? I think I view the other alternate cryptocurrencies as they went down a very interesting experimental path to kind of, see if maybe something wasn't being done in Bitcoin land. And now I think you're seeing that swing back, right? I think you're seeing that a lot of the sacrifices and shortcuts that were made in that ecosystem have kind of led people to, I don't want to call them dead ends, but there are problems where maybe there isn't a solution, right? You're not guaranteed a solution to a scientific problem, right? In the same way that the 30 people who tried to build Bitcoin prior to Satoshi, like, weren't guaranteed a solution, right? You could have spent any number of $1 million on building it. Maybe the NSA spent, millions of dollars to make a digital cash and didn't do it, right? And Satoshi did, right? So science is interesting because you're not guaranteed results, right? We don't know how long these networks are going to last. And yeah, so I always kind of try to bring it back to that theory, right? I think essentially, we have this problem, right? And the problem the whole industry has is that blockchains scale poorly, yet we know that we want aspirationally to bring the benefits that they provide in terms of, speed of payments, kind of digital economics to the world, right? So like you're gonna have to kind of back up that far, I think, to have the perspective before kind of getting in the weeds. Because I think if you're just kind of focused on like, okay, what are the TVL of these different networks? Sure, maybe the TVL of these is increasing in over the last 6 months, but AOL's user count was really high. And AOL is not a public, they're not even a company anymore. Well, AOL Time Warner exists, right? So they exist as a brand name. So yeah, I mean, I think it's just a reminder that there's not a guarantee of success, right? Like just because you prove some metrics, but obviously, right there, I think the threshold that I would say is that, is it affecting Bitcoin users, right? And this is the kind of rule of thumb that I think we take internally. It's, if it's not something where there's a mass of our constituency talking about it, maybe it's best to let that conversation occur naturally. And when people are talking about it and begin to talking about it, cover from there. I think it's always better to be late than potentially pushing somebody, into or validating a claim that could potentially, risk capital, right? And I think we don't want people to lose money, right? In journalism, you want to do the least amount of harm, right? So I don't know if that answers your question, but Kyle, you want to add anything?
No, I definitely agree with your points there, Pete, and we'll just comment a little further is that from a technical standpoint, this technical stack that we've been talking about with Bitcoin, we don't really know what all those pieces are. To activate $1 trillion that is suddenly potentially movable and usable in some potential way overnight, that hasn't been done before. And more so when covering this, when talking about it, when investing in it, whatever it may be, the angle, it is a massive mindset shift for people. And that is also, I think, what, and sorry, Pete, I don't mean to keep coming back to this, but I think it's a good example. The Bitcoin Magazine article sparked is that people's mindsets weren't yet there as to what this could be and how this idea of building on Bitcoin or what Bitcoin could be, should be, etc. It was just a moment in time that hit a lot of people that just weren't there from a mindset and still aren't in some cases. And I think that that's an important thing when writing about this industry is this is a dramatic mind shift, not just for us that are a part of this industry and have been for some time, but for anybody that looks at this industry and anybody that has ever thought and or owned a Bitcoin in any capacity, let alone any cryptocurrency as well. And so covering this industry, not only is it good to know the history, not only is it good to be skeptical on what is, what isn't, etc., but it's also good to remember that this is a very big mind change for so many people. And everything we've discussed today hopefully helps to set the tone and context to the content that you write so that it comes across as those types of things are being covered and thought of in your stories.
So I got a question via DM. Feel free to DM me, or you can just type in the channel there. I'll read it off. Or if you want to raise your hand, we can call on you. But I got a question here from my audience member. If not L2s, how would Bitcoin scale? Question. Kyle, you want to take that?
Will and I both smirked, so Yeah, go for
Yeah,
it.
you can't quite scale the base layer more because the issue with the Bitcoin base layer is like there's only a certain amount of data that you can have to keep the full node running to specifications we want. You just hit a lot of performance issues, and then you'd hit a lot of fee issues. So, this goes back to like 2017 thoughts earlier, like maybe if we increase the block size or do this or that with the Bitcoin L1, then we could scale it. And like there are certainly some things to like think about there, especially as like the cost of hardware continues to go down. That's actually one thing I'd say like the Ethereum network was like directionally correct on. It was like the cost of hardware itself was going to continue to go down. But over time, we really just don't want, so much data on an L1. So there's not like a ton of options besides that. There are some interesting ideas with putting like UTXOs into like virtual machines and kind of doing stuff like that to be able to optimize the L1 and kind of keeping things as close to L1 as possible. And then there's also like the idea of this meta protocols, which I think is sort of taking over right now, where hey, maybe we use meta protocols like ordinals or runes or BRC20s, and they kind of exist within the world of L1, but they're also keeping most of their data off chain, and the trust assumptions are completely changed. So I wouldn't say it's a scaling solution, but I would say it is a solution for a problem that people don't know how to fix. And people seem to like it, right? So like if there's a world where we have stable coins on a meta protocol, like a sidecar to Bitcoin, I think people would use it. And you just need to update your trust assumptions versus using your self-sovereign Bitcoin.
I refer to those, Will, as 1.5.
Yeah.
It's all still kind of figuring out. So it's above the core L1 Bitcoin and what we've kind of been talking about today of L2s and the future above that. These are the meta protocols kind of sit in between as well. And just to add on to Will's point, financially, it just won't make sense at a certain point as well. As the halving continues to reduce the minor rewards as well, ordinals, we saw fees shoot up 280x. So quite a growth moment, and it just won't be financially sustainable either.
Yeah, I'll maybe add a different take on this, maybe voice some of the kind of people who are more skeptical of scaling. I think their argument goes something along the lines of, people are holding their value in Bitcoin. That value is steady, if not up over time. And there's no guarantee that Bitcoin has to be used for more than that. Potentially its definition of success is just allowing people, some people, maybe even not all people, to kind of hold their Bitcoin outside the government, and maybe that's good enough, and maybe nothing else is possible, right? So again, I think going back to the idea of science, right? I think oftentimes there's kind of a willingness to treat this as, hey, this is the internet. Eventually, we're going to get video over the internet. But there was all sorts of things that were supposed to be over the internet, 3D worlds that you could enter. You could go back to read from Wired from the 90s, and they would have told you that by now we would be in the Matrix type worlds, feeling, and there'd be protocols for feeling and smelling sensory data, that never materialize, right? So we're in the realm of science, right? Sometimes there's not an easy answer. Okay, we got a couple direct messages here. We only got 7 minutes, so. Do we see as a winner takes all L2 landscape, or do you see there being a fragmentation where there are many L2s? I'll toss that over to Will or Kyle, who wants to take that.
I'll just go quick and short. It will not be a winner takes all. We want to actually see fragmentation. We also want to maybe see some design specific or some very categorical specific things, as we did with Lightning to the earlier conversation, things that focus on what they do and what they do well, and kind of resetting the conversation from L2s back to Bitcoin layers. There are going to be many pieces to this puzzle, and we will have to see various networks. That said, we will probably see a consolidation of a lot of the networks that have launched today, and we'll kind of comment on this earlier as well. But I will also go on and then say that we will see that consolidation at some point, and we are just seeing the beginnings of opening up bridges to Solana, the Move ecosystems, and to others as well. So we've got a little bit more time as this kind of expands before it contracts.
Will, quick thoughts, winner takes all, L2?
I think it could be a winner takes all. I don't know. It's way too early. Like there's not that many people using Bitcoin daily for payments, and that's the purpose for an L2. Then like We have a lot to learn. Could be more than one. Like if Lightning continues to just slowly grow, and then maybe there's a BitVM based ecosystem that starts doing really well, and people like that. But I think over time we just have to kind of watch because it could go any which way. Um, I think at the end of the day, like people hopefully won't know what they're even using. Like there might be a state channel on some sort of BitVM thing, and that would be like a Lightning based project with a BitVM thing. And who knows what's going to be happening in 10 years. Things have changed really fast the last 2 years, but I think we just still don't know.
Got a couple more questions here. What's the difference between a sidechain and an L2? Somebody want to take that?
Oh no.
Well, I'll let you.
That's unfair to ask with 5 minutes left. And Pete, you're going to have to jump in here. So I would say a sidechain allows you to port your Bitcoin natively between Bitcoin network and the sidechain indiscriminately and with full control over that UTXO. I think some L2 schemes, I mean, they would sort of fit inside that definition, but they don't quite run as parallel. So like a roll up kind of looks like a sidechain in some ways, but I don't think it like really keeps pace with the Bitcoin network. You're sort of like going up on one block and exiting at a future block when you want to, whereas a sidechain is going to run with that with the Bitcoin network. But Pete, I'd be curious what your thoughts are on
I
this.
mean, I think the sidechain is a bit of an outdated term, just in terms of, but the kind of the original nomenclature kind of existed where, I think there was a desire for there to be alternative consensus systems that would kind of you would peg Bitcoin and then sort of be able to unlock some different features with it through an actual different consensus process, right? So whereas Lightning, you're moving your Bitcoin over into an L2, but that L2 is going to settle to the blockchain that is mined by Bitcoin miners, and there's no other group that you're trusting other than the Bitcoin miners for it to settle, right? We're usually in a side chain. I don't know. I think once you get into networks like spider chains or the POS systems that are trying to kind of, you lock your Bitcoin and move it over, and there's some other form of settlement, right? Like the actual transactions are being validated and processed by some other system. I think you're into side chains world, but that model could always break, right? I think it's maybe all models are useful and they're not always correct, right? Kyle, you want to add anything there, or
No, I think you guys covered it.
let's see, we've got a couple questions. Let's see. In Ethereum, a sidechain doesn't derive its security from the L1 as its own validator set usually, but that's Ethereum, right? Yeah, I think that's a kind of key distinction there. Whoever added that. Okay, we got one last question then, I guess. Do you think that Bitcoin L2s will require crypto media outlets to have more Bitcoin specific journalists moving forward?
Probably. I mean, that's
I think
the
both
bull
are
case
good.
I'm positioning for Blockspace. Like, I think there's room for more Bitcoin focused media at the moment, especially specifically like industry focused, going like down a level. I think Pete would agree with me. Kyle.
I'm sort of long-term biased on that, right?
Yeah.
I'll throw in for the third there. I think it's good that you have some that are not, so they can provide a different perspective and also maybe challenge again what has been done before that might not work, or again is just already copy and paste. But yeah, I'm a third party in agreement on this one.
Yeah, I don't think you'll make a lot of money, but I think it's needed. So
All right. Well, appreciate everyone's time. Want to throw it over to Joyce. Obviously, appreciate everyone engaging the ACJR. Hope you enjoyed this as a resource. Hope we were able to answer your questions. If not, feel free to reach out to me on Telegram or Twitter. Always happy to be a resource for people writing stories. And thanks for your support for the organization.